Welcome to our module on culture. In this module, we will be discussing what culture is, variations of culture, what norms are and sanctions, and how culture continues to develop. So, to get started, it's important that we define the term culture. We often use this term interchangeably with another really frequently used word, and that is society. And so, I want to give you some definitions of both so that you don't confuse the two in this course. So, culture is the totality of our learned, socially transmitted customs, knowledge, material objects, and behavior. It's everything. And that's part of the reason why it's such an abstract concept, because culture includes everything around us, whether it's material or non material. Material culture is that culture that we can see and touch around us. So, whatever device you're using to view this video on, that's material culture. Your food, your clothing, all of the props and tools that you use that make you a student, also part of your culture. Material culture is what's going to tell the story about who we are one day when someone digs it up on an archaeological dig. Non material culture are all of the ideas and values and beliefs that we hold. You can't necessarily see it or touch it, but it's still there and it's just as important as those material elements. A society differs from a culture, and that a society is more about space. Society is really defined by looking at territory. So perhaps a group of people who live in the same territory and are relatively independent of people outside of the area. And typically they do participate in a common culture, but not necessarily just one culture. Um, Typically, we view societies as being the largest form of human group, with people with a shared heritage, and where people take that culture and pass it down from generation to generation, while members also work to preserve culture. Within a society, oftentimes we use geopolitical boundaries in order to understand one society from another and to determine this versus that society. And so we might use region, we might use states or nation states, and national boundaries. And even now, because of all of our, you know, communication and technological advances, we even can say that we have a global society, right? And so, yeah, there are different uses of that term. In sociology, our use of the term society differs from how you might have seen it used in popular culture or how you might use it day to day. So here we're talking about that territory, that large group of people, and not so much like smaller societies like secret societies or fraternities or sororities. Some other definitions for culture include looking at whether culture is high or low or popular. High culture describes a pattern of cultural experiences and attitudes that we see among the highest members in our society stratification. So, those who are elite, those who are wealthy, and those who are very powerful. And usually, you know that something is high culture because it has some particular characteristics. One, it might require a particular knowledge set. That means you need to know terminology, you need to know practices and how to appreciate that culture. So, for example, if we were talking about wine tasting as an element of high culture, then there's a knowledge set that goes along with that. Knowing what wines pair with what, knowing how to taste a wine and what terms one uses to describe the flavor and the scents and aromas. And also just knowing the actual practice. Now, if it was my wine tasting group, most of that tasting would just be on drinking wine, right? Oh, this one's good, this one's not. But if you were an actual connoisseur of wine and wine tasting, then your focus would probably be on first smelling the wine, maybe doing the little swirl thing and aerating the wine, and then trying to get all of the notes of woodiness and aromas and things like that. Another thing about high culture is that it can be very expensive. And that's one of the things that helps to make it exclusive, and that the cost of participating is a gatekeeper that keeps some people out and, you know, basically closes that element of culture to outsiders. And then finally, the last characteristic for high culture is that it's often located in an exclusive space or a space that's not accessible, meaning that you might need a membership or to be part of a group or a club or to know the right person. A lot of sports are very exclusive and very much connected to high culture. Looking at golf, for example, you can't just play golf anywhere. Unless it's miniature golf, but that doesn't count as high culture. That would be low or popular culture because almost anyone can access it. And it's pretty affordable, and you don't need to know anything about playing golf. But with golf in the elite classes, you need actual access to golf courses and to country clubs. You need to buy those expensive tools that are needed, and clothing as well. And you need to have a knowledge set about how to play it, and how to properly set your form and things like that. Low culture is culture that is associated with cultural experiences and attitudes as well, but among the lower class segments of a society. So low culture would include any like music or sports or games or anything like that that you would primarily find associated with those who are in the lower rungs of society. Can you think of any examples of low culture? Right? It might be more difficult if you are not a member of a lower culture segment of society. And sometimes it's really hard to distinguish low culture from popular culture as well. So it gets a little confusing. And so, low culture for me growing up, one of my practices was smoking a bit. And as a former smoker, there are elements that of smoking that can be high culture and some that could be low culture. So high culture might be like smoking cigars or smoking a Cuban cigar in particular. And there's a knowledge set to how to smoke it. There is a knowledge set to even how to store it and which cigars are good. Many are very expensive, and typically you enjoy these in some exclusive spaces often. You might even have to be invited to someone's home in order to enjoy their new cigars. But on the low culture end, growing up, I also smoked something called a black and mild, and you may not even be familiar with that because maybe you weren't raised in low culture. But a black and mild is a cigar or you could buy a package of them fairly inexpensively. Um, and they're pretty low quality. And I mean, all cigars are unhealthy, but I'm sure that these are highly, highly addictive and problematic compared to regular cigars. And so, yeah, usually black and milds are associated with lower class segments of society, particularly in the inner city. Um, Now, the term popular culture refers to all of these cultural experiences and attitudes again, but that exist in mainstream society. So these ones cross high culture and low culture. They're typically pretty accessible, located in spaces that are available or accessible to the public, and people widely enjoy them. And oftentimes, popular culture gets a bad rep because it kind of seems like the low hanging fruit. But there's a reason why it's popular. Typically, popular culture is pretty good. It captures our attention, and we are truly interested in it. And so, for example, the Marvel films are popular culture, right? And they're pretty great movies if you really sit down and look at them and watch them. Especially for me, I have watched them all in various orders, from chronological to time series. And so I can actually say, like, they're pretty good. Um, and so popular culture, we can easily access, we can understand it. It doesn't require any particular knowledge set. And it's not typically necessarily associated with low culture. It can be, but not always. Another term that I want to point out before we move on is cultural universal. Cultural universals are common practices and beliefs across societies. You will find them often. And usually, cultural universals are just like culture itself. They're typically some sort of adaptation that we have created or made as a means to help fulfill human needs. And so, some cultural universals or elements of culture that you'll find all over the place are things like sports, cooking, or some way of preparing food and eating food. Typically, like some way of naming people, some form of marriage or mate selection, medicine or healthcare of some sort, some ceremonies for funerals, and then other things like sexual restrictions. Who you can and can't have sex with is usually defined within most cultures. And so, yeah, cultural universals we typically can find everywhere. Not always, but probably 99% of the time. And that's what makes them universal. Culture shock is a term that, once again, we use very often and probably can't easily give a definition for. But we define it as a sense of disorientation that one feels when they come in contact with a culture they're not familiar with or enter a culture that seems foreign to them. Typically, that disorientation can be discomfort, uncertainty, and even fear that results from being immersed in an unfamiliar culture. Culture shock isn't necessarily a negative thing. It's kind of just like a basic human reaction to being in a strange place or a new place. What can be negative is how we respond as a result to culture shock, right? One of the responses that we can have is ethnocentrism. And that's a tendency to view our own culture as the standard or the norm and to compare other cultures to that culture. Typically, with ethnocentrism, we are not just centering our culture as the norm, but we also believe that our culture is superior to others. And so we'll judge other cultures by our own culture. Most of us are taught some level of ethnocentrism globally through our own schools or our own countries. We're taught that our nation is the best and our nation is the greatest or it's number one, right? And so it's kind of embedded into some of our socialization. Ethnocentrism can be very problematic because we can often start to see other people's cultures as wrong. So, for example, Americans are well known for being a tad ethnocentric as we travel. I blame that on our geography and location and partially on our own culture a bit. But one of the things that I've heard frequently and that I used to even say myself is that people in other countries might drive on the wrong side of the road, as if driving on the right side of the road is the natural and correct state of things. In fact, really, it's just that some people drive on the right and some drive on the left, and that neither is right or wrong, right? And so that can be somewhat of an ethnocentric observation. Another response that we can have is one that is on the flip side here, and that's cultural relativism. Typically, we want people to lean towards cultural relativism, and view others' behavior from the perspective of their own culture. So instead of judging a culture in comparison to my own, I would then look at the behavior of people within that foreign culture or different culture and judge it from the sense of the norms of that culture, right? Um, so here I would be analyzing behaviors and customs of any culture from that culture's own standards. Cultural relativism, while it's usually the goal and what we're working towards, it's not perfect. And sometimes it comes with downsides. For example, we might use it to excuse something called a taboo. Taboos are kind of viewed as being like very um, negative, first of all, when they're done, but almost as being like a crime against humanity. It just shan't be done. You should not do it. And so, for example, cultural relativism could be used to um, excuse some practices that could be dangerous or that could be harmful for members of a culture. One example could be honor killing. In some pockets of the world, in particular in the MENA or more Middle Eastern and North African area, there are still some groups that practice honor killing. And honor killing means that in order to protect the family's honor, someone who has done that family dishonor or is suspected of doing a family dishonor will be murdered. And so the most common practice that I'm familiar with of honor killing is the murder of young girls and women as a way to save a family's honor. So perhaps a girl is found out walking with a boy, or perhaps she kisses a boy or has a boyfriend. Or in some cases, perhaps she is sexually assaulted or raped. In these instances, someone that or a culture that practices honor killing might kill that girl in the name of their culture. And so, do we want to excuse that? Do we want to say, well, it's their culture, let's just measure them by their standards? No, probably not, right? And so, sometimes cultural relativism isn't quite the response that we're going for. Another response is xenocentrism, which is the opposite of ethnocentrism, and that's a belief that another culture is superior to one's own. Um, that one happens as well. I know many, as an expat, I know many Americans who find other cultures to be superior to American culture. And so it's also problematic, being blind to the problems of other cultures as well, or thinking that others are superior. I typically don't judge a culture as to which one's better or try to rank them, but more so as to what are their differences. Now, another issue that comes with culture is cultural imperialism. And cultural imperialism can be the result of um, ethnocentrism, and it could even be connected to xenocentrism. With cultural imperialism, you are deliberately imposing your own cultural values onto another culture. And so you're actually trying to force that other culture to fit into or assimilate into your cultural values, traditions, expectations. You may never have thought of language as an element of culture, but it is. Language is actually the foundation of every culture. We define language as an abstract system of word meanings and symbols for all aspects of culture. And so language includes our actual audible speech, written characters and numerals, symbols, nonverbal gestures, and expressions. Language is actually really important in sociology, especially if we're looking at interactionism, because we view language as not being only a way of communicating with one another, but also a way of showing what's important to a certain culture. The Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is mentioned in your text, describes the role of language in shaping our interpretation of reality. Our world is limited by our language, and our language is shaped around what's available in our world, right? So we can tell based on how a culture uses language what is emphasized and what's important. So, for example, in Arabic, which is often linked in with both Christianity and Islam, There are lots of terminologies that include the concept of God or Allah. So you might say something like inshallah, or like God willing, or mashallah, like, oh, thank God, like what a blessing, right? And this is often used in outside of religious contexts. I even picked it up and started using it because we would hear it so often. In the US, we use language that as well that has those religious undertones in it. We might say something like "thank God" or "God willing," but we also have some other elements of our culture that we see that shows up, and some of them are more fun than others. For example, in the US, we have an extensive use of terms that deal with violence or war. We talk about conquering space or fighting the battle of the budget or waging a war on poverty or drugs. We might say that somebody is making a killing in the stock market or that somebody has bombed an examination, right? And we might even use these words in very positive ways, like something cool used to be the bomb or the bomb, depending on what your generation was. We also look at how gender intersects with language as well and what that means within a culture. So in the US, while we don't have like gendered terminology and conjugations and things like that, we do use gender um, and carry a lot of meaning with it when it comes to occupations and roles, right? When we are talking about someone who is in a position that we typically view as being masculine traditionally, um, those positions often we will link to being a man. So if we hear doctor, someone might think man, right? It's also a measure of sexism and other things as well, and just the patriarchy in general, but it definitely is a reflection of our culture. Nonverbal communication, gestures, objects, and words that form the basis of our human communication, um, is also really important. We use that within our own cultures, but also to communicate with people, especially when we don't speak the same language or use the same characters or abstract symbols. Nonverbal language can be really beneficial in helping to express something without having to necessarily know um, the same language, and also in order to signal to one another as well. Babies are really good actually at learning nonverbal communication and will often use that as their first language or their segue into language. However, nonverbal language can be really problematic because it isn't something that is universal. And so while, the peace sign might be like, just throwing up the deuces or like greeting or saying goodbye to someone in one culture, in another, it could be very either violent or insulting, right? I remember learning about one practice and then always being kind of anxious about it. And that was like having the bottom of your foot facing someone else and how rude that was. And as an American, as long as my feet weren't touching you or in your way, nobody really has ever cared like how your feet are pointing at someone. But if you, as as a non-American in some cultures, having your foot up on your leg and having that sole of your foot or shoe facing someone could actually be considered as an insult. And so nonverbal communication can be much more problematic when it's misunderstood than sometimes even verbal communication. So I love that we get to go into norms and sanctions now. We'll talk about it in more detail when we get into our deviance module. But now we're just going to do a little introduction. And I think it's really important to the understanding of sociology altogether and the science of it all. So norms are established standards of behavior maintained by a society. We view norms as being the behavior that is normal or normative. And norms are classified based on their formality and their importance in a society. So when it comes to formality, there are formal norms and informal norms. Formal norms have generally been written down and specify strict punishments for their violators. So these could include laws or some sort of governmental social control that is codified, and that if you violate it, you will probably face some sort of specific consequence. Informal norms are generally understood, but not precisely recorded. It's just something that you learn along the way, and it's an unwritten rule. So, for example, you know that if you were to enter a classroom, you would have a seat in a chair and not on the floor. If you didn't do that, we might just think you're weird and we'll have an informal reaction to it, but you probably wouldn't go to jail or receive a citation or get expelled from school. When it comes to importance, norms are also classified by their importance in a society. Mores are those norms that are deemed highly necessary to the welfare of a society. The root in there for more is linked to moral, and so usually they actually have a high moral value. Um, Taboos are mores that are so strong that the violation there is considered to be extremely offensive and even unmentionable. Taboos would be things like bestiality, incest, pedophilia, or something like that. So taboos are usually viewed as being like a crime against humanity. Mores, again, highly necessary for the operation of society. Things like they can be laws, but things like don't steal, don't kill, and things like that. Now, I always like to ask my students, is killing someone a more or a taboo? Right? Because taboos are types of mores, but is it just a general more or is it very much like a crime against humanity? Think about that. Would killing someone be taboo? So the answer is that typically it's not. Um, Typically, there are some understandings that killing is sometimes acceptable in society. So, for example, if you're at war and someone dies as a result of your actions within a actual military operation, then you have not committed a taboo, right? You may not have even broken a more or violated a more. And so, not in all cases. With folkways, these are the things that kind of govern our everyday behavior. They don't necessarily have a moral foundation. They're just more traditional. They're the things that we do just because that's how we do them. So I gave the example of sitting in a chair rather than on a floor in a classroom. There's nothing moral about that if you sat on the floor. The same about, for example, riding an elevator, right? There's a way that we ride an elevator. There is a kind of dance that we do. You know, you get on and then you take your space, somebody else gets on, you move over typically, and then the third person gets on and you rearrange. And as the elevator gets more and more crowded, we have different ways of arranging ourselves that we just kind of like, we just know. We've learned them informally. Um, and violating those, for the most part, doesn't have a moral foundation. So, for example, if you were to sit on the floor of the elevator, I don't know, I'm just obsessed with people sitting on the floor, I guess. But if you were to sit on the floor of an elevator, then you've probably just broken a folkway and not really a more, right? It's not a big deal. It's not highly necessary for society. So on the other side of the equation, when you violate a norm, typically there may be a sanction that follows that violation. And these vary by formality, once again, but also by character. So a sanction is a penalty or a reward for for conduct that is concerning a social norm. So with a sanction, you may either be penalized or you may actually be rewarded for your behavior or your conduct. So for formality, a sanction that is formal would be one where it's the result of like a written rule, and this is the written consequence, right? So, for example, if you exceed the speed limit, that is a formal norm that's been broken, and typically it's going to be met with a formal sanction, which may be you being pulled over or receiving a ticket or a citation or a fine. Informal sanctions are those that are not specific to a formal norm violation. And so informal sanctions are things that aren't they aren't citations, they aren't codified, um, but they could still be kind of humiliating or unpleasant. So, for example, if you trip and fall, then somebody might give you an informal sanction by laughing at you or pointing at you or something like that. If you speed and like really blow someone away, even though you are breaking a formal norm, you might only receive an informal sanction. So somebody beeping their horn or screaming at you or now engaging in some road rage. So yeah, yikes. Sanctions are also classified based on character. We have positive sanctions, like rewards, a pay raise, a medal, a word of gratitude. And we have negative sanctions like fines or threats or imprisonment or stares or glares, right? And you can combine these characteristics with the formality. So you can have a formal positive sanction, like maybe because you got all A's, you now get to be on the dean's list or something like that. So there you go. We got sanctions, we've got norms, and they're going to come up again when we get into deviant behavior. We also talk about cultures in terms of levels. And so, two of the levels that we look at are subcultures and countercultures. A subculture is a segment of a society that shares a pattern of customs and rules and traditions that differ from the larger society, but they can fit neatly within the main culture or the overarching culture. And so, for example, in the image here, you can see that these are cosplayers, and maybe they are nerds and geeks, but typically they are not a problem when it comes to how they interact with the greater society. They are able to maintain their own customs and rules and traditions and be as nerdy as they want to be within the overall culture. A counterculture, however, is a subculture that opposes aspects of the larger society. And so a counterculture can actually be at odds with society. They probably don't fit in, and they actually might be persecuted by society, sometimes in a way that's deservable. For example, neo Nazis and the KKK or white supremacists would be examples of countercultures. The hippies and their practices in the 70s, for example, and 60s, would also be an example of a counterculture. Although today we don't view them as being as at odds as they were, they definitely were. Our culture continues to develop. And the process of that development is broken down into several concepts. So, innovation is the process of introducing a new idea or object to a culture. And there are two forms of innovation. One is discovery, and that's where we make known or share the existence of an aspect of reality. So, for example, we might find out the structure of the DNA molecule. Did we invent it? No, we just discovered it, right? Or identifying a new moon of Saturn, right? We didn't put that moon there, it was always there. We've just now discovered it. Invention is where we take existing cultural items and we combine them into a form that didn't exist before. So, for example, cars would be inventions, TVs or televisions would be inventions, and even the concept of democracy is viewed as being an invention. And so invention doesn't mean that something brand new has just like developed out of the sky or dropped into our laps. It means that we are taking what we already have and using it in new ways. When it comes to how our culture spreads, we describe this as diffusion. And diffusion is a process where a cultural item spreads from group to group and from society to society. And that happens in lots of different ways. One way or one method is exploration, right? We learn more about a society or culture by actually entering that society and culture. And as a result of the exploration, upon our return to our own society or culture, we bring back some new cultural item or idea. Another way is through military conquest, which is similar to exploration, only the violent and forcible form of that. And actually, exploration has often led to, very negative impacts, especially on the culture that we're engaging with. So often we're exposing people to disease, to culture that challenges the status quo of that environment, and it's not always a positive thing for everyone involved. The mass media is another way that culture is diffused. For example, through watching anime and manga on Netflix, right? And maybe learning some elements of Japanese culture. Be careful with that though, because it's not accurate oftentimes. Tourism is another form of diffusion and how we pass information along. And then there's something that's called McDonaldization, which is really interesting. And I'll follow that in the text after this video because it's a crucial element of our culture today, and that we diffuse culture through mega corporations. Um, and they're spread around the world like McDonald's, right? And it pushes not just Western culture, but it can also cause impacts in the opposite direction as well. So, for example, there are McDonald's around the world, and at most of them, you can find very similar menus, except sometimes there's a couple of items that might be specific to that country or nation. And so it's really interesting to look at. So, for example, you probably never have had a curry burger before in the United States, but if you were to go to Japan and maybe some other nations, you might find that. One of the popular dishes in the UAE, where I lived previously, was the Micarabia, which was basically a chicken sandwich that was halal, or basically safe for those who are practicing Muslims to ingest. And also had like some fresh vegetables in it and a sauce that was very Middle Eastern, and also some Middle Eastern or Arab, they called it literally Arabic bread as well. And so this was a popular thing that people might order. And you probably would not find that here in the US. When we look at culture, we also look at the technology. And technology really is a lot broader than how we typically use it in everyday conversation. Technology, it's all the cool stuff we have, right? Like our computers and laptops and our phones and things like that. But it goes beyond that. Technology is really any cultural information or items that we have about our environment and material resources that can be used to satisfy our needs and desires. So technology is like any cultural information and knowledge about materials that we can use to solve problems. Okay. Technology can be used to solve problems, but it can also often cause problems as well. So we can see that a lot of our technology can actually cause physical problems in the universe with our waste and pollution and things of that nature, but it can also cause social problems. Two of those types of problems are on this slide, like the digital divide, right? The digital divide describes how the availability and access to technology differs around the world and even within societies. or even just like a neighborhood, to a level where some are at a disadvantage because they don't have access to that technology. I remember when I was in high school, this was around the time that people were starting to increasingly get PCs at home. And so for the kids who couldn't afford to have their own PC, and definitely for those who didn't have access to the internet, they might be at a disadvantage when it came to academics. They couldn't type their papers, they didn't have a spell checker, right? They couldn't go online in order to do research. Some of us were still using like an Encyclopedia Britannica and limited to what was available there. And so we might be experiencing a digital divide in those situations. We saw this very clearly during the pandemic, where everything went online, and suddenly we had to find a way to make sure that everyone had access to necessary resources in order to access their educations. Cultural lag is another type of problem that can emerge from technology and technological advancement. And this is where we see that there's a gap between a new technology becoming available and when we learn how to properly use it and integrate it into society. So again, when I was younger, about 20 years ago or so, email was becoming more popular, and learning how to use email and when to use it and what the expectations and rules were on receiving responses and replying and things like that was far, far, far behind. And so I didn't know when it was appropriate to call a professor versus emailing a professor, and what you could ask for by email versus what you could ask for, um, face to face or in the phone, over the phone. And so there were rules that weren't there yet. And there was etiquette that wasn't there yet. It wasn't in place that we now have, but that we were developing as we were going along. The same with cell phones. Like before, it wasn't so easy as like just silencing your phone or setting the do not disturb mode. And so now, like if somebody sends you a text message at like 11 p.m., you probably wouldn't be upset because you could set your own like do not disturb. Almost like it's almost as if though it's up to you and it's your fault if you're disturbed. But in the past, there was kind of like this unwritten rule, that some knew and some didn't because we were still developing that etiquette that, after 9 p.m., no text messages, no phone calls on a cell phone. And also the idea that, just because it is always available or it makes a person available more often, does that mean we should expect them to actually be available? What is the appropriate use for work, or for non-work? And so, yeah, we're still doing some of this when it comes to the evolution of our smart devices and things like that, and when they're appropriate and when they're not, and how to use them. Now, I think our new cultural lag is looking at this AI generated content and how to use it appropriately. Instead of demonizing it and trying to run for it, but also instead of just like jumping full force into it and letting it take over everything. So yeah. All right. Well, thanks for sticking, with me through this module, and I'll see you next time. So when we're talking about culture, another term that is really important is values. And again, it's one of those terms that if I ask you, how do you define values? Like, not what are your values, but how do you define the term value? It's really, really difficult to define. You can kind of say that it's something that's important, right? That we deem as being important in a society or important to an individual. But really, values are much larger than this, of course. They are collective conceptions of what is considered to be not just important, but also what's good, what's desirable, and what's proper in a culture. So here we have a very, very detailed list of many of the top values in the world, global values. And I want you to look and choose which are the top 5 values that you hold as an individual. Then I want you to think about which top 5 values are important to the entire nation or to being an American altogether. How are those values different between your list of top 5 and what you think the American list of the top 5 values are? Are they different? Are they the same? And why do you think that is? Enjoy. I can't wait to see the responses on this.